Hello and welcome back to Rushing the Field, National College Football Show from NBC Sports. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. And Joshua, we have officially reached the part of the season that didn't exist before. The national championship game would have already been played. And here we are with three more meaningful college football games. How are we feeling? Like, do we need more green juice, ginger shots? Like, how are we surviving?
Yeah, got the big coffee here. As you do feel these days start to pile up a little bit in college football, with week 0 as a part of the season now, stretching all the way to the 20th of January. Like, we got to make sure we're physically fit to be able to complete the mission here. But super excited about these semifinals here. Obviously, a lot to dig into, and some craziness that's kind of happened in between too.
Yeah, for sure. And we will get into our previews of both of these games. Really compelling matchups that we will have later this week. We are also, as we're recording this Wednesday morning, the Cotton Bowl is still on as scheduled, but everyone's monitoring that. I'm flying to Dallas a little bit later today, trying to beat the snowstorm. But that's certainly something to
You
track.
worried about a little snow? I mean,
They don't have
people down
Joshua,
south these people down south are scared of a little snow.
They don't have snow trucks and like the salt and all of those things. Like, we live in Chicago. Everyone's prepared for this.
Texas has a big enough economy that they could get some trucks. Like, come on, guys.
Yeah, you would think. So we'll get into those games in just a second. A couple of news items that we want to start with here. The first one was something that has been in the works for a few months, but still a little bit jarring to see become finalized, and that is Northern Illinois of the state Illinois, Northern Illinois University, NIU, is joining the Mountain West as a football-only member, effective 2026. So it's the 2026 season. And we don't know exactly where all of their other sports are going to be yet. They announced that they are still exploring their options and having conversations, even still with the MAC, about options. But there's the Horizon League, there's other conferences there. But this is a little bit of a weird one when we think about like Cal and Stanford in the Atlantic Coast Conference. This is one of those where Illinois is not very mountainous, but they are going to the Mountain West Conference, as like the Mountain West and the Pac-12 are kind of rebuilding and figuring out what they want to be. Joshua, what do you make of this move and that it's football only?
Yeah, not very mountainous, like 800 feet above sea level. So
No.
Certainly feels strange there. First off, I'll say this is I think it was the right thing for them to do to put their other sports somewhere where they're not going to be burdened by travel. And part of the reason why is because it'd be really expensive. And if they took all the sports there, they'd probably have to cut. So I do think that makes a lot of sense. This is weird, but Thomas Hammock got a chance to catch up with him yesterday. As a matter of fact, the head coach for NIU football, he talked about this idea of like, yeah, our facilities they're kind of lagging. And like, I've seen what they have out there on the West Coast. He mentioned UNLV. He mentioned Boise State and what their stadiums look like and what their practice facilities look like. And he's like, we got to be able to keep up one way or another. And the other thing that he mentioned was he wants a 6-hour radius for recruiting. But if he could grab a couple guys out there on the West Coast, he's got a guy on his coaching staff who's from California. Like, if they could get a couple a year that could be an impact for their roster, it would certainly make sense for them. So this is strange. It feels very weird. This is the new age. We just have to get used to seeing this kind of stuff here. And so, I'm curious to see what they look like when they start competing. Are they going to be kind of like Cal, where, we had Calgorithm and it felt like they were able to kind of create their own lane within the ACC. I'm not exactly sure, but they're going to have to be a team that can find a fit and a way to stand out in some ways too. But I'm curious to see how this all happens in a couple years.
Yeah, a lot going on with NIU. Still very much in the news because they get brought up every time we talk about Notre Dame. Still alive in the playoff as well. Really good point that you made, though, about keeping other sports in a different conference. I really do hope that at some point there is like kind of a re-reckoning with some of this stuff, and some of these other sports can go back to being regional, and maybe football decisions don't have to drive everything. So I do give NIU credit for that, for figuring that out as part of this move that they want to make for football, that they are going to keep their other sports regional in some capacity. So we'll continue to track on that. it's an interesting realignment move. And then, of course, the MAC had already like preemptively added UMass, so they're not very worried about like the number, the size, and how their conference works. One other little tidbit: Ashton Jeanty officially declared for the NFL draft. Probably, I would have to imagine, the top running back in the draft. And I put this in the rundown, Joshua, just because there's so much going on with the playoff, and I think we move on to the winners so quickly sometimes. But I did just want to make sure that we took a moment to just shout out Ashton Jeanty and the college career he had, the decision to stay at Boise State this year, which clearly paid off, got them into the playoff, got him to New York as a Heisman finalist, and definitely improved his draft stock. And I feel like, you're more of a draft guy than I am, but it does feel like people are maybe realizing they need to value running backs right now. Like he might be coming in at the exact right time, maybe compared to like 5 years ago.
Yes, you're spot on with that. I think the timing is huge for him. I know a lot of draft people have him as a top 10 prospect on their big boards, just like regardless of position. Of course, fit is going to matter and who needs a running back in the upcoming draft. But like I look at him as a guy who absolutely is at the right time. So we're seeing Derrick Henry with the Ravens and how much they use him and how big a focal point he is within that offense. I look at the Detroit Lions and the way that they use all of their backs, but people laughed at them when they took Jahmyr Gibbs so high. And I was one of those guys who said Jahmyr Gibbs was a can't miss because he's so versatile. He can catch it. He can run. He's hard to bring down. He's really shifty, all those different things. We watched Ashton Jeanty basically put the team on his back at times and have to run through 5, 6, or even 7 defenders to be able to make a big play. And he did it pretty consistently. And even against Penn State, where he had probably his worst day of the year, Penn State had to hit him with 5 guys to get him down every single time. That's the type of player that's getting ready to go to the next level. And to your point, he is entering the NFL at a time where teams are saying, well, defensive personnel probably got a little bit lighter. You got linebackers out there playing at 230 pounds. If we can punch them in the face with a great running back, we're going to have team success. So I'm looking forward to seeing it. I think he is absolutely worth the first-round pick. I think he's going to be an immediate impact in the NFL. And shout out to Ashton Jeanty's phenomenal career. He was amazing to watch.
Yeah, I feel like you're right. Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, like people were like, okay, these guys are special. You do need to go early to get them because they are that worth it. And Ashton Jeanty is absolutely that guy. So, can't wait to follow kind of that part of the pre-draft process as people maybe who haven't paid attention or don't know his entire story get to learn it. And that's going to be really, really cool. But let's dive into these national semifinal games now because we do have some meaningful football still to be played. Texas and Ohio State will play in the Cotton Bowl on Friday night as scheduled right now. And then Penn State and Notre Dame, they get things going on Thursday night in Miami. So no weather issues there. It looks like both the teams are there. They're getting set for this game. And that will be the first of the semifinals. The first thing that jumps out to me, broadly speaking, looking at these semis, is that you've got some teams that have not been in the position to play for a national championship in quite some time. I mean, I think we've obviously spent a lot of time on Notre Dame and why it was so big for them to win the Sugar Bowl and beat Georgia. First big postseason win in 3 decades for them. Penn State, they've been in this position over the entirety of James Franklin's tenure of like they have good seasons, they can win double-digit games, but they can't win the big ones. They can't beat the Ohio States and the Michigans of the world with any regularity. They have an opportunity against, Notre Dame to make that statement, change that narrative. And then Texas, my God, I mean, they're the ones that we started. Is Texas back? What does it mean for a team to be back? Because they weren't for such a long time, really since Vince Young. And then, of course, Ohio State, they are the most recent national champion of the group, but it's been a minute. And we've spent a lot of time on, the 4 straight losses to Michigan and not winning the Big Ten over that period as well. So you have blue bloods, but you also have teams that haven't done it in a while and really have a huge opportunity to make a statement in this era of college football.
Yeah, it's as blue as you can get in terms of blue bloods that have made it to the Final Four, which is something interesting to see in this age of bringing in more teams where you had, some first timers in there and certainly Penn State goes in that category, right? But you're looking at Arizona State and Boise State and the ability for an Indiana to get in. You're like, oh, maybe we'll have a different team by the end. It's like, no, it's the Blue Bloods, which I think is really unique. The other thing for me is these are 4 coaches that people swore could not win a national title. And I was very much on like maybe Ohio State has to take a look at Ryan Day because I'm not sure he's going to be able to get it done. Here he is, like a game away from being in the national championship again. Sark, people had started to question, like, is Texas really taking that step forward? And I think last year went a long way for him, but folks wanted to see him do it again. He's doing it. And then, it's Marcus Freeman who will have those like confounding losses. And James Franklin, as you mentioned, the guy who just couldn't get over the hump in the Big Ten. So I do think for all of these coaches, like there was a lot on the line for them to be able to make this type of run. We saw Marcus got the extension. I think people were pretty comfortable with Sark after last year. Ryan Day has completely turned the narrative around, and here's James Franklin. Like, this is your opportunity. So I'm excited for that standpoint too, is like we got some narrative busters going on as well.
Yeah, and to your point, whoever wins the national championship, it'll be the first time for that head coach. We've lost Nick Saban from coaching in college football. Mac Brown, left North Carolina. Like you're in a period where there's only a couple of coaches who have active coaches with national championships, Kirby and Dabo. And you're going to add somebody else there who's kind of they're going to reach a different chapter of their career and influence, I think, in the sport as well by doing that. There is also one other kind of subplot of not just first time coaches, that have an opportunity to coach for a national championship, but we're guaranteed to have a black head coach in the national championship game for the first time because you have Marcus Freeman facing off against James Franklin in the semifinal. So the winner will play for a national championship. There's been a lot of talk about like, what does that mean in this sport where there are so many obviously black players, and we talk about like the coaching pipelines and second chances and who gets opportunities. And so it feels like it's a really important moment in coaching for both of these. And I think both of these coaches understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it is huge. And there's like this weird discourse that happens on the internet now where it's like, oh, it's 2025. And like, why does race have to matter in these conversations? And it's like, well, the answer is because it's 2025 and people have been playing college football for over 100 years. And this is the first time that we get a black head coach in FBS championship game. It is hugely important when you start to distill it down. I'll put it like this. The Southeastern Conference did not have a black coach this season, will not have a black head coach next season. That's why this type of thing is important, is because you could still have a power conference that in a given year wouldn't have a black coach at all. Right. And so for either one of these guys to be able to put together the season that they have and ultimately make it to the most important thing in the sport, as I keep reminding people, crowning a champion is the reason anybody plays the game. It's the reason we all watch the game. It's to see who can win a championship. I think it's huge. And frankly, gotten to know both of these guys. I've known Marcus since I was in high school. Phenomenal guys, right? Like you might not love them all the time because they don't coach for the right team or whatever the case is, but they have been dudes who have been able to put together the rosters that they need. Their guys believe in them. They have a defined approach to the game of football. And so I think it's a phenomenal thing to see for all the folks out there who are like, is it a big deal in 2025? It's always going to be a big deal.
And it's always a big deal because like there's always going to be someone who watches something and didn't know that was possible. Yep. And there's value in that, even if it doesn't apply to you specifically. There is value in that. And, we can both say that as people who are in a profession that's very white male dominated. Yeah. Like it matters. So I think that's going to be a really cool subplot here, as well as, just all 4 of these coaches and the different narratives that they're trying to bust. So let's get into those. Let's talk about these 2 semifinal games. We'll start with the Orange Bowl, Notre Dame versus Penn State, Thursday night, 7:30 Eastern. Notre Dame favored by 2.5 points. Key injuries to track here. Jeremiah Love is apparently on track to play, per offensive coordinator Mike Denbrock. That is going to matter, how close to 100% he is. It didn't ultimately matter a ton against Georgia, and certainly Riley Leonard as a runner becomes a factor as well in Notre Dame's run game if Love isn't, close to 100%. But there are a lot of things to track. Obviously, also Abdul Carter doing everything that he can do to play, per defensive coordinator Tom Allen on the Penn State side. Also a huge factor, best defensive player for the Nittany Lions. So big picture, we'll start there. Penn State trying to win a big game. Huge opportunity here. And they actually, what's crazy about this, not to get too far ahead, but, Ohio State certainly seems to be the favorite right now with the way they played through 2 rounds. You could have Penn State, whose entire narrative as a program under James Franklin is closing the gap with Ohio State. They can't beat Ohio State. Well, they beat them once, but they can't beat them regularly. We always come out of those games talking about the gap between Ohio State and Penn State. Man, if they both win, then Penn State has to go through Ohio State to win a national championship. Like, you can't really script that any better.
No, and I'll say this, right? Like, this ain't about the previews, but the one thing that I've started to get closer to in this 12-team format that I cannot stand is it does feel like if you win this, you would have had to go through the best teams to get there. We've talked about Texas as one of the best teams in college football. So if Penn State were to win, right, like they would have to beat Texas, and we would feel comfortable about that. If they beat Ohio State, they're beating the best team that's playing right now. Yeah. We would feel comfortable about that. Ohio State had to beat Oregon, who was the best team all of the regular season. And Notre Dame already beat Georgia, who has been one of the best programs for the last half decade, right? And so, like, yeah, James Franklin, if you get that opportunity, like, there would be no questions. There are 0 questions about who the best team is at that point, because you would look at the path and say that whoever got there would have to. But to your point, this is a huge game, right? Like, it's a big game for somebody who people say can't win the big one. And frankly, I feel like Penn State is the better team. As I look at this on paper, it doesn't mean that Notre Dame doesn't have a chance. I think there are very clear pathways for either team to get a win. But I look at the way that Penn State is constructed on defense and how strong they are in the front 7. Even if Abdul Carter's a little bit banged up, I do think their front 7 can still come to play. And I look at their secondary, which I think is the weakness of their defense, and say that they can hang with Notre Dame's guys, right? Like, I think they can. I flip it over to the other side, and I look at Penn State offensively. If they just do the things that make them successful in this game, I think that they have a really good chance of being able to move the football. I love their run game. I think Drew Aller at his top end is a phenomenal quarterback. And there's the Tyler Warren question of what is Notre Dame going to end up doing to try to handle him. And so I do think that this is a matchup that has a ton of intrigue. But when I'm just kind of looking on paper, even though Vegas says that Notre Dame's the favorite, I like Penn State a little bit better as a team.
I think that makes sense. And it's probably Vegas reacting to beating Georgia, right?
Sure.
Which fair. But you're right about the way that it matches up with different things that are maybe Penn State's weaknesses being less of a factor. Because if you are more concerned, about that secondary, well, Notre Dame has been looking for like these elite receivers for a few years, just like Penn State, actually. There's so many parallels actually between both of these programs.
Yes.
But Bo Collins is really good and Jaden Greathouse, but they're not great. Like you can cover them. You can make them non-factors and try to make Notre Dame one-dimensional, which leans into your strengths of where you think you can stop them. So I think that's an important factor here. I think too, with Notre Dame, they're very comfortable winning games the way that they beat Georgia, right? Where they didn't really throw the ball. They capitalize on turnovers and they're really good on special teams. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're always like the better team or the more talented team. That means you're just really good at things in the margins that decide games. And so I think that's very possible that those are the things that decide this game again, but they may not, put up more yardage. They may not be the better team over the course of the game, but they might make the key plays, which is what they do. So I'm not saying anything against Notre Dame, but I'm saying in a game like this, you could, like you're saying, go through each of these categories, give the advantage to Penn State, and still have Notre Dame win it because of the way that they win games.
Right. And to your point, I do think the margins of this game are going to matter. There's this discussion about the coaching matchup where James Franklin isn't known as being a great game manager, where I think Marcus Freeman has proven to us that he can manage the margins of the games. We saw it against Georgia, not only with the great special teams play, but kind of, situations and being creative and creating panic for another team. I think that's going to come into play because I do think this is going to be a tight game. There are going to be opportunities to do that here. One of the things that does intrigue me, though, about either one of these teams, when Penn State played Ohio State, they did not score an offensive touchdown. And the one drive that they put together that was really good, they completely lost their mind, did not try to get the ball to Tyler Warren, and they didn't get into the end zone from the 5-yard line, which is wild. for Notre Dame coming off of this game against Georgia, as well as they played, they really didn't put together a drive. They got the ball back off of a strip sack on like the 12-yard line. It was a one-play touchdown, and they had the big special team score. And outside of that, it wasn't a lot of putting together big drives that ended with touchdowns. They had the long drive at the end, which they needed. They ended with the field goal there. But it's not lost upon me that against the best defenses that either one of these teams has seen, they've struggled to stay on the field with long, consistent drives that end in touchdowns. And I'm curious if points are going to be at a premium in this game for that very reason.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And especially, we watched the rock fight. That was the first half of Notre Dame, Georgia. They could definitely have some of that in this game. And certainly I think turnovers, both of these teams, we've seen them both force turnovers over the course of the CFP as well. It's also a big step up in competition for Penn State. Part of the reason that we're talking about this being a big game, big opportunity for a head coach that's 1-14 against the AP top 5 is that they haven't played teams in that category yet. They played SMU, last team in the field, and then they played Boise State, and we had so many conversations about the seeding there and how Boise State really wasn't the number 3 team in the rankings, but they were the number 3 seed, and so Penn State's path has been a huge storyline. And they did what they were supposed to. They won the games that they were supposed to, that they were favored in. And that's why this is kind of okay, now it gets hard. This is the real deal now. This is where James Franklin changes the narrative if he wins games because of the step up in competition. I wonder, and you've obviously prepared for this. You've never played this version of the playoff where there's all of these additional rounds and the amount of total games that you could play. But this was a storyline in 2014 as well, when the season got longer, when you guys won a national championship. So do you think that it matters that Penn State had 9 days to prepare and Notre Dame only had 7 because the Sugar Bowl was later, but then it got pushed back an extra day? Does that play in here?
Yes, it matters 100%. I can remember in our preparation, so we had the regular bowl prep kind of situation when we were going into our semifinal. And so we got our work in. In Urban Meyer, one of the best things that he did was he had a very defined plan for how he approached the postseason. So first 5 practices going into the game against Alabama, we were just working on conditioning, basically. Second 5 practices was a lot of fundamentals, just playing football, making sure we could block, we could tackle, ball security, catching the ball, things that happen when you have the long layoff. And then the last 5 was our game week. Then after we played Alabama, and I feel like this is Notre Dame, right? We played Alabama, and we were oh my God, it's the most physical game that we've ever played, period. We were beat up, and it was rugged out there. And some of us went up to Urban, and we're we got to pull back off of practice. We if we can take the pads off, that would be great. But you need to trust us that we'll get all the work that we need to get in, but we can't bang in practice leading up to this game because we're hurt. And he listened to us, and it ended up working out. And the reason I bring that up is these guys need to heal up. We see what Jeremiah Love's at. You don't think those couple days would matter to him trying to get back for this one? You have to be very careful about how you approach practice, but also this idea of how can you get as fresh as possible on that quick turnaround, I think does pop up. So yes, it's a big advantage, in my opinion, for Penn State to have been able to kick their legs up a little bit more and they're not as worried about all the travel, getting back home and then getting back to the next site. All of these things are considerations that these programs have to make. And I do think the 2 days is a huge deal.
Yeah. And you mentioned, especially for an Abdul Carter who's trying to get back on the field, every hour, every day counts there.
Seriously.
Okay. So last thing before we move on to the other semifinal, we talked about it a little bit. Tyler Warren, he's such an X factor. He's such a unique player, and the way that Penn State calls the game. We talk about this all the time with Andy Kotelnicki and how, creative he gets and he tries to, direct snaps to Tyler Warren, tries to do a lot of different things with him. How do you expect Notre Dame to attack him? Who do you expect to cover him? And how do you try to, or what is success against Tyler Warren in this game? Is it just making sure he's not the guy that has a breakout game? You're okay if they're able to run the ball, or I don't know. Is it Xavier Watts? How do you handle a guy like Tyler Warren?
So I think success, first off, to answer that question, looks like making Penn State go to kind of the B game plan, right? So the A game plan would just be regular targets in the pass game. The B game plan is now they're going to some of the shovel passes. Now they're going to some of the direct snaps. Now they're handing him the football. Now they're trying to hide him in the line of scrimmage. Like, that is the B game plan. And I think if you get Penn State to that point with Tyler Warren, you've done a good job of taking them out of their initial game plan for him. I think they're going to try to put Xavier Watts on him. And he's a big safety. You know, I love the guy. I think he's a hard hitter. He's also a ball hawk. And he's really good in coverage. Now, that puts them in a bit of a bind because you're going to have to ask some other guys to maybe play a different position in the back end than what they're used to doing. And then there's the question of, do you still want to try to get a double team on him, which I would try to do. Penn State makes that very difficult. And it was the thing I came on, we talked about it with Jeremiah Smith against Michigan. They had the dude on the line of scrimmage the whole time, so you could set a double team to him. When Tyler Warren's moving around, when they're shifting and when they're motioning him, it's much harder to set a double team. It's much harder to communicate who's got the double, where the help is, all of those different things. And I think that's where Penn State can build an advantage to try to make sure they can get him in one-on-one situations. So it's going to be tough. I also think that Watts is a great player, and if there was somebody that could be up for the challenge, it would be him. He has risen to big moments this year, and he's been able to take the ball away. He's been able to X out people of the game plan. He's been able to make big hits and knock the ball from the receiver. So I'm curious to see that chess match there. I want to know what Penn State's answers are if it's not working initially with Tyler Warren. And then to answer the final question, I don't think the run game is going to hit the way that it did against Boise State. But if it is, they should continue to do it. Like, that was the biggest flaw in the game plan, was they went away from something that was working. Whatever works against Notre Dame, I think they have to do a ton of it. Because as I said, I think drives, points at a premium in this one.
Yeah, and James Franklin was asked about that, right? About like, well, how do you balance, Andy Kotelnicki is just like a very creative guy. And there's a lot of pre-snap motion. There's a lot of again, creativity. We'll put it all under that umbrella. How do you balance that with, like, maybe you should just run the ball? Maybe you should just do something that's a little bit more boring, but it's working. It's more effective. And James said that, like, that is who they are. And it's the creativity helps bring out the aggressiveness, and they go hand in hand. And that's what he's comfortable with. So yeah, there's times where he's like, no, I don't think we should do this, or I think we should do that. But it's how they got here. And so I think that they're going to continue to do it, Joshua.
Have you seen that it's like a little meme or whatever, and it's the offensive play caller in their huge play sheet, and then it's the guys on defense, and it's like an index card.
Yes.
And I think that's the problem with these offensive play callers, is they spend so much time during the week installing these gadget plays and these different concepts and these awesome designs. And they say, I have to do it because we spent the time doing it. Whereas the guys on defense are like, well, we got our base bucket of calls, and then we've got a couple blitzes here. We'll see what's working. And I feel like some of the offensive guys need to shrink the menu down a little bit. You don't need the whole Waffle House menu on the sideline with you. And for Penn State, it's more like the Cheesecake Factory menu. Like maybe you just need the steakhouse menu where you got a couple of go-to items, and that's what you go with.
You hate the Cheesecake Factory. This is multiple times you brought this up.
I think it's a good comp. I don't hate them. I think it's the right situation.
A lot of different things on that menu for sure. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. Andy Kotelnicki and Al Golden on the other side, the chess match between those two coordinators. Going to be really fascinating. Yeah. Got to be a little careful about, where the game plans are around the facility, right? All
right. What's your prediction for this one?
Okay. So my prediction is Notre Dame. Notre Dame winning, I guess covering 2.5 points. I think this is going to be a very tight game. I think points will be at a premium, and I would not be shocked if Penn State won. But I think I've been making a lot of my Notre Dame picks over the year on consistency, and the different ways that they find to win games. So I will stick with them.
It's an interesting thing for me because I do think Penn State's in a more gotta have it in terms of like narratives and what this season means. And so I do think that we probably see their best because of that. I think this is going to be a tight game. I don't feel like either one of these teams has the ability to really blow this one out and pull away. And for that reason, I think I trust Marcus Freeman a little bit more to have those plays that can win in the margins, whether it's a blocked punt or a big return like we saw. Does he have a creative situational thing that ends up being big in this football game? I tend to believe that he's the guy who can get it done. And so for that reason, as I said before, Penn State, I think, is a better team coming into this one. I think Notre Dame is the team I feel like I trust a little bit more in this situation.
Well, and again, this is a head coach. For Marcus's flaws, they've lost games against teams that they should beat, but they are up for big games. Like it's the opposite of Brian Kelly, right? Where they always took care of all the business that they were supposed to, but they struggled in the big games. Marcus is the opposite. So I am with you there on trusting him a little bit more in those situations and having the pulse of a game, knowing when to go for it on fourth down, what you want to call in those situations, and things like that. Let's flip it to the other semifinal. This is, again, talk about blue bloods, the bluest of blue bloods, right? Texas and Ohio State. Friday night, as of now, scheduled for 7:30 Eastern at the Cotton Bowl. Ohio State favored by 6 points. Feels about right. Just how absolutely dominant they have been through 2 games in the CFP. You mentioned this earlier. Ryan Day has coached himself off the hot seat. Like, it's been incredible what we've seen from the Buckeyes since their loss to Michigan. You've got a Texas team that has had their ups and downs. They were fortunate to be in this position. They were 4th and 13 away from losing to Arizona State in the quarterfinal round. That was a game that they struggled in a lot of different areas, right? ASU was able to move the ball really well against them. We talked a lot about Cam Scadaboo and everything he was able to individually accomplish to will that team back into that game. Yeah. But we've just had questions throughout the year about Texas's run game, Quinn Ewers' ceiling, just kind of who Texas can be. So to me, this feels about right that Ohio State is almost a touchdown favorite because I was at the Rose Bowl, right? Like, I saw that high-powered offense up close and personal. And even if they don't have like the first quarter and a half that they did against the Rose Bowl, or the first quarter against Tennessee, even if they're like 50% of that, that's still probably the best team left in the playoff.
Yeah, and I mean, do you need to have the first quarter, the first half, when Texas has been a team that in the second half has not necessarily performed, right? Like, you look at the SEC championship, they go into halftime with a lead in that one. Gunnar Stockton brings Georgia back. There were moments in the second half against Clemson where that thing felt like it could get really interesting. And then, of course, Arizona State in the second half of that game was the team. They dominated. It felt like Texas kind of went away. And so I do think this is like you have to weather the storm of the beginning part of the game if you're Texas. You can't let Ohio State do what they did to Tennessee and Oregon. But you also have to make sure that in the second half of the game, you're up for it. And there's a legitimate question for me with Texas. And we didn't talk about it as much with Penn State because I don't know if it's as big of a factor with them. But with Texas, they played the SEC championship game. They had to, their guys were in there for a long time against Clemson. And then Arizona State, you could see their defense getting worn down toward the end of the game. They got the big plays when they needed to. So it's not to say they disappeared, but they were wearing down. Those guys have played, I think, they played like close to 100 snaps against Arizona State. They've played significantly more snaps than the Ohio State guys have. And I think that's going to matter, especially when you're talking about this offense that's making guys run now with Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Ibuka and Carnell Tate. And, you're tracing Chavion Henderson down the sideline. Like, I think the legs of Texas is a factor in this one. How much do they have left in their legs?
It's a really good point. And certainly with the way that Ohio State has played, they have had the luxury of taking guys out whenever they wanted to, when they build up big leads like that. And Jeremiah Smith, I think, is worth a specific spotlight here because we said it all season. We were tracking all the different Ohio State freshman records and what they were trying to accomplish. But what he has done, if people did not watch them week to week, if you only watched him in the playoff, you understand how special he is. And I was watching back on National Signing Day, that clip where Ryan Day is like, he's either asked, like, did you get the facts or, the document from Jeremiah Smith or whatever. And he just like kind of like fake collapses. Like he was so nervous and so relieved when it came in. And everyone was kind of like, dude, it's like a teenager. What are you doing? Why are you so dramatic? And then you watch him. And like, I remember we were there in the spring for the spring game and like, they did not hold back. Like, they hyped him up as high as anybody else. Like, there was no like, hey, let's wait and see. He's going to be young. They knew how special he was going to be. And so it's been really cool to get to watch like the rest of the world see it and to see like a lot of people missed his first touchdown at the Rose Bowl because they're still watching the end of the Peach Bowl. Like, he was just like, it was instant impact. These are big, big plays. His catch radius is crazy. Like, they don't even have to be perfect throws, but like, what a luxury for Will Howard. Man, it's just a special dude. And so I think you're putting him in a different category now. And then you still have Emeka Egbuka, who is phenomenal, the veteran.
Right.
He's going to have a great long career in the NFL too. But it's like, I don't know what you do if you're Texas. And like you said, you're a little tired coming into this game. And now you got these two guys where you can't let either of them get much space because they're going to beat you. They're going to torch you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Texas is the best built defense that Ohio State would have seen to stop it outside of the Michigan game plan. But Ohio State has evolved offensively to try to get away from that, especially with the run game and some of the ways that they have created different runs, but they're also throwing it to run the football. And so teams are like, people are like, why can't people do what Michigan did? It's like, well, Ohio State's forcing you to play them a little bit differently now, where if you're going to keep your safeties out of the fit, which Michigan did a ton, Ohio State's not dumb enough right now to try to run it into the middle of the defense. And by the way, most teams don't have the two inside guys that Michigan had. And so I do think these matchups are becoming a little bit easier for them to figure out. All of that said, I thought that Tennessee had the best pair of corners to try to go up against Ohio State. Ohio State torched them. They torched the living hell out of them. I think that Texas has the best overall secondary. And so now I am curious if this is a team that can cover them a little bit tighter than we've seen other defenses cover them. And then the next question becomes, can this Texas front handle Ohio State and their run game and create pressure without adding extra guys from the secondary? I think Texas has a phenomenal defensive front, but Will Howard has not been pressured by anybody, and that includes Oregon, who maybe had the most underrated D-line. You know how I feel about Derek Harmon. I think he's the second best defensive tackle that'll be in the draft. They had Jordan Burch. They had Mateo Uyunglele. Neither one of those guys had an impact on the game. Can Ohio State's offensive line continue to hold up and force people to have to bring extra defenders if they want to pressure Will Howard, who has played his best football of his career at this point, by the way? So it's real intriguing from that standpoint. And we haven't even talked about the Ohio State defense versus Texas's offense, which Ohio State really good defensively, but I also think Sark knows how to dial it up. And when he gets to call the plays that he wants to play, that offense is really difficult to stop. This is one of the most intriguing matchups we could have gotten.
Completely agree, right? Because again, so you've got the Ohio State receiver room versus, the Texas secondary. You've got the matchup of Sark versus a defense in Jim Knowles that has been really, really dominant most of the season. But certainly, they've given up points. They've given up, in the playoff, but never, in actual, like, these games were not close. They were not dicey. And, they had that long stretch of like not giving up a passing touchdown. We just saw a lot of dominant performances, including at the end of the game against Penn State too. One other key factor on that side is right tackle Cameron Williams for Texas. He has been banged up. He was one of the ones where you're using this as an example in the first round of the bye versus a first round game. He gets banged up in that, and that becomes a factor because they really struggled to run the ball against Arizona State. And so he practiced at least during the media period of time, the brief practice on Sunday. So there definitely seems to be some optimism about him coming back, but that's a factor as well, because like we have seen Texas play in some of these games where they could not run the ball at all. And that impacts, again, how you defend them, what you can call, and how you work here. I know you think we'll see Arch Manning in this game, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to get the run game started. This is not like a Quinn Ewers shouldn't play or he's played bad enough to lose his job.
Right, in packages or specific moments.
Yes, this is I think it's matchup dependent, but I also think that for Texas, they have to find ways to run the football. Both times against Georgia, they did not run it well. They lost that game. And then against Arizona State, that game became really dicey, one that was very losable for them, and they didn't run it at all. And I look at Ohio State, and where their defense has struggled the most all year long is Dylan Gabriel in the first matchup was able to use his legs, and it became a factor in the game. Then they go on and they play Nebraska. And Dylan Raiola is able to use his legs as a guy who's not a runner, and it becomes a factor in that game. Against Northwestern, which is crazy. You take the sack yardage out of there. Northwestern's quarterback, Jack Lausch, had a pretty good day using his legs, and Northwestern was able to move the ball a little bit on this Ohio State defense. Probably the best passing day anybody had post Oregon against Ohio State. And then finally, Nico with Tennessee, the only offense that they had was Nico running the football. So if I'm looking at this as an opposing offensive coach, I have to say, how can we incorporate some quarterback run? And Quinn Ewers has been banged up. He's not very mobile. And I think they got to bring Arch in at times to try to run the football from the quarterback position and hopefully open up the rest of the running game.
Yeah, that one's going to be a really fascinating game. And certainly, again, Ohio State coming out of the Rose Bowl performance, odds-on favorite to win it all. I think, like, just all of us as football watchers, we're like, all right, like, Ohio State is the team to beat here moving forward. I think they win. And I think that they cover the 6 points because, this is just they're steamrolling people. It gets out of hand. And, again, I think Texas has dudes, but so did Tennessee, so did Oregon, and it didn't ultimately matter. So I think, again, I don't know if they'll be 100% firing on all cylinders, as Dan Lanning put it, where like there was just nothing you could do to stop them. But I think that they will be close to that. They will be much more of that version than the version of Ohio State that we saw lose to Michigan. And I think Ohio State's going to play for a national championship. So I picked the Buckeyes here.
Yeah, I think for Texas, like if they were going to win this game, Sark would have to be as aggressive in his play calling, like the first 10 plays essentially that we saw against Arizona State. He would have to have that for their offense just dialed up, can go down the field, 3 plays, 75 yards, score, and do that multiple times. And then defensively, like it's take the football away. It's make Will Howard do dumb things. And I'm not sure they can do it because nobody's been able to do it this postseason. I've got Ohio State winning this game. And frankly, I think the only reason that it's Ohio State favored by 6 right now is because they got to go 200 miles away from Austin to play the game. It's going to be a favorable crowd for Texas. I think if this was played anywhere else, that number would be bigger, but I got Ohio State winning and covering.
Yeah, it is an interesting, a little bit of I mean, again, they're the higher seed, right? They were an at-large team, but they are closer to home. The weather could be a factor here as well, in terms of kind of the crowd and maybe even when this game gets played, if it gets adjusted at any point. So lots to track there. These should be 2 great semifinal games. This is part of it, right? Like there might be blowouts in earlier rounds, but you're getting teams that are prepared, that have won, that are tough, that are deep, that are physical, the deeper you get into the playoffs. So hopefully we get 2 great semifinal games. We will be back to recap the semifinals, and then we will do a much deeper dive heading into the national championship game. So, if you don't already follow, like, subscribe, rate, review our pod here on Rushing the Field, please do so because we've got plenty more coming your way. Joshua, I hope you enjoyed the games. I hope listen, we talked about the players. They're a little banged up. Well, again, so are we. Caffeine, sleep. That's right. We got a long season as well. It's the longest college football season yet for us, too. So I will see you soon. I hope you enjoy the games. For Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. Thanks for listening to Rushing the Field. We'll be back soon.